Hidden deep within the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where ancient mountains clutch the mist and outsiders are met with generations of suspicion, a family's story lay buried until the year 1976. Their tale would only come to light thanks to the journals of a traveling physician. The Caldwell clan had called the same remote valley home since before the Civil War. Their weathered wooden homes were scattered along the banks of a forgotten creek, a winding waterway nestled between steep ridges. This was more than just geographical isolation, it formed the foundation for one of the most disturbing cases of familial intermarriage ever documented in American history. It was in October of 1976 when Drive Martin Lell, a physician with the Appalachian Health Service, first encountered the Caldwells. He was in McDowell County, Kentucky, conducting rural health assessments. His detailed journals, discovered decades later, provide a clinical yet haunting window into what he discovered when he followed a narrow dirt road, guided by directions from concerned locals who spoke in hushed tones about those peculiar mountain folk. "The first thing I noticed," Dr. Lell wrote, "was the unusual physical characteristics shared across multiple generations. With alarming frequency, he observed facial asymmetry, disproportionate limbs, and pronounced malformations of the jaw. What was most striking was not merely the presence of these conditions, but how they progressively worsened with each subsequent generation. The family's history can be traced back to 1843, when brothers Samuel and Jeremiah Caldwell arrived from Virginia with their wives. They sought cheap land and isolation from a society they deeply distrusted. Historical records indicate that after a harsh winter in 1851-52 claimed the life of Jeremiah's wife during childbirth, the family structure began its tragic evolution. County records from 1853 show that Samuel's daughter, Martha, married her first cousin, James, who was Jeremiah's son. This initial marriage between first cousins, while discouraged, wasn't entirely uncommon in the isolated rural communities of the era. What followed, however, was a pattern that would span generations, a pattern of increasing isolation and decreasing genetic diversity. The family tree I was able to reconstruct, Dr. Lell revealed, showed that by the fourth generation, the degree of relation between partners had intensified dramatically. A closed genetic system had been created by the geographical isolation, combined with growing social ostracism. The most severely affected members of the family were discovered living in the remotest cabin, the one furthest up the hollow. Here resided Elijah Caldwell, born in 1943, a fifth-generation product of consanguineous relationships. His physical appearance was a shock even to the experienced doctor. Elijah had been born with severe facial deformities, including a dramatically receded chin, asymmetrical eye positioning, and a cranial structure that led to persistent neurological issues. His sister, Sarah, exhibited similar physical characteristics along with severe cognitive impairments that had never been assessed or treated. Their own parents, who were themselves first cousins, displayed milder but still noticeable physical traits that local residents had come to associate with the Caldwell name. This case was particularly remarkable because of the detailed documentation of how these traits progressed across generations. Photographs discovered in a family Bible, some dating back to the 1860s, showed subtle but discernible changes in facial structure appearing in the third generation, changes that became dramatically more pronounced with each subsequent birth. The scientific literature had documented isolated cases of consanguinity, Dr. Lell noted. But rarely had anyone observed the accumulated effects across 5 continuous generations in a single family line. What I was witnessing was the compounding nature of recessive genetic traits when they are repeatedly concentrated within a limited genetic pool. The doctor's journals reveal his personal struggle between clinical observation and human empathy. "These aren't specimens to be studied," he wrote, "but people born into circumstances not of their making, who have adapted to their conditions with remarkable resilience." Indeed, the Caldwells had developed their own internal social structure, an economic system based on limited trade with outsiders, and even distinctive speech patterns that incorporated archaic English terms long abandoned elsewhere. Their isolation was not merely imposed by geography, it was reinforced by generations of perceived and actual rejection from the communities surrounding them. The family's history paralleled the broader Appalachian experiences of exploitation and neglect. While coal companies had stripped the surrounding mountains, they provided minimal compensation to local landowners. Public services, including education and healthcare, rarely reached these remote hollows. The Caldwells, like many families in the region, existed in an America that most citizens couldn't imagine still existed in the modern era. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You will not want to miss a single moment of these hidden historical revelations that shine a light on America's forgotten communities and the scientific realities they faced. Hit subscribe now to ensure you catch the next chapter in this powerful investigation. Pieced together through county records, church documentation, and local accounts, the Caldwell family history revealed a troubling pattern, one that began almost accidentally but became increasingly deliberate as their isolation deepened. Following that initial cousin marriage in 1853, the family began withdrawing further into their hollow, a response driven partly by increasing ridicule from nearby communities. The real turning point, according to local historian Margaret Dunham, interviewed in 1982, came during the 1880s when industrialization began transforming larger Appalachian communities. The Caldwells rejected these changes, viewing them as corrupting influences. Their resistance to modernization coincided with their increasing physical distinctiveness, creating a cycle of mutual avoidance between them and neighboring settlements. By the third generation, distinctive physical characteristics had become noticeable enough that children attending the local schoolhouse faced persistent harassment. School records from 1895 note that the last Caldwell children to receive formal education stopped attending after repeated incidents. This educational isolation further limited their opportunities for meeting potential partners outside their kinship network. Sustaining themselves through subsistence farming, hunting, and limited trade, the family deliberately minimized contact with the outside world. Their properties were situated at the convergence of three steep ridgelines, natural barriers that reinforced their seclusion. The only access road frequently became impassable during winter months and spring floods, sometimes cutting off the family entirely for weeks. It's important to understand that this wasn't simply a matter of ignorance, explained Dr. Harrison Reynolds, a geneticist who later studied Dr. Lell's findings. By the fourth generation, the consequences of continued intermarriage would have been visibly apparent. However, by that point, social factors had created a situation where external marriage partners were effectively unavailable, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. The most extensively documented case was that of Thomas Caldwell, born in 1921, whose parents were first cousins once removed. Historical photographs show his pronounced jawline deformity and asymmetrical facial features. Medical records from a rare visit to the county hospital in 1936 noted his stunted growth, cognitive delays, and vision problems. Thomas later married his second cousin, Mary, who herself exhibited milder but noticeable genetic effects. Their children, born between 1943 and 1952, demonstrated significantly more pronounced traits, including Elijah and Sarah, whom Dr. Lell would eventually encounter. A third child, Jacob, born in 1949, had such severe physical deformities that he rarely left the family property. According to local accounts, Jacob's limited mobility and distinctive appearance became the source of local legends about mountain creatures, stories that further discouraged outsiders from approaching the hollow. What made the Caldwell case scientifically significant was how clearly it demonstrated the compounding nature of recessive genetic mutations. While first-cousin marriages alone typically increase the risk of congenital defects by 4 to 7% compared to the general population, the Caldwell family had created a closed genetic system over multiple generations, dramatically amplifying these effects. Each generation effectively reduced the genetic diversity available within their reproductive pool, explained Dr. Reynolds. Recessive mutations that might remain dormant in a diverse population became increasingly expressed as the same genes circulated within this limited family system. The physical traits we observed represent only the visible manifestations of this genetic concentration. Beyond the physical characteristics, the Caldwell family also experienced higher rates of infant mortality, pregnancy complications, and reduced life expectancy. Church records from the local parish documented multiple stillbirths and childhood deaths throughout the family history, often attributed simply to natural causes or the will of providence in the language of the time. Thomas and Mary lost 3 children before their first birthdays between 1945 and 1950. The emotional toll of these losses, combined with increasing disability among surviving family members, created immense hardship that the family bore largely without external support or medical intervention. By the 1960s, the family's isolation had become nearly complete. The mechanization of agriculture had rendered their traditional farming methods obsolete, while their limited education prevented adaptation to changing economic conditions. The construction of a nearby highway in 1962 paradoxically increased their isolation by bypassing their valley entirely, rendering their community effectively invisible to passing travelers. A particularly revealing document from this period is a letter written in 1964 by the county public health nurse, expressing frustration at being unable to convince the family to accept vaccination services. Their distrust of outsiders has become so ingrained, she wrote, that even basic medical care is viewed with suspicion. The children particularly show signs of various preventable conditions that go untreated. This suspicion went both ways. Local medical professionals often approached the family with preconceived notions and clinical detachment rather than genuine empathy. One doctor's notes from 1968 referred to the Caldwell children as textbook examples of consanguinity effects rather than as individuals deserving dignified care. The discovery of coal deposits on neighboring properties in the early 1970s brought mining operations closer to the Caldwell Hollow. This increased external pressure would eventually force contact between the isolated family and the wider world, setting the stage for Dr. Lell's fateful visit in 1976. When Dr. Martin Lell began his systematic study of the Caldwell family in late 1976, he was entering largely uncharted scientific territory. While medical literature had documented individual cases of consanguinity, few researchers had the opportunity to observe its effects across multiple generations within a single family line. What we're witnessing here, Dr. Lell wrote in his research journal, is not merely the result of individual cousin marriages, but the cumulative effect of a dramatically reduced genetic pool maintained over approximately 130 years and 5 generations. The concentration of recessive genes has created a living demonstration of genetic principles that textbooks can only describe theoretically. His initial examinations revealed patterns consistent with what geneticists now recognize as autosomal recessive disorders. These conditions occur when a child inherits 2 copies of a mutated gene, one from each parent. In diverse populations, these mutations remain predominantly recessive. But in closed genetic systems like the Caldwells, they became increasingly expressed. The most visible effects manifested as distinctive facial features, prominent brow ridges, unusual ear positioning, and jaw malformations that affected speech and eating. More concerning were the less visible conditions: heart murmurs in 3 family members, neurological abnormalities affecting coordination, and compromised immune systems that made even minor illnesses potentially dangerous. The remarkable aspect, noted Dr. Reynolds in his later analysis, was how these traits followed classic Mendelian inheritance patterns, becoming more pronounced and consistent with each generation. By the 5th generation, certain characteristics appeared with almost 100% frequency, suggesting homozygosity for these traits had become the norm rather than the exception. Jacob Caldwell, who was rarely seen by outsiders, agreed to be examined after Dr. Lell gained the family's trust through repeated visits. His condition proved the most severe, with pronounced skeletal malformations that had never received medical attention. X-rays revealed spinal curvature, hip dysplasia, and bone density issues that modern medicine could have addressed if treated early, but which had become permanently debilitating through neglect. The intellectual impacts varied considerably among family members. While some exhibited significant cognitive impairments, others demonstrated normal or even exceptional intelligence in specific areas. Elijah, despite his physical challenges, possessed remarkable mechanical aptitude, maintaining the family's aging equipment with ingenious adaptations using salvaged parts. Dr. Lell's journals record his surprise at discovering Sarah Caldwell's exceptional memory. Unable to read or write due to a lack of formal education, she could nevertheless recall complex family histories, local plant knowledge, and traditional remedies with extraordinary precision. This cognitive variability challenged simplistic narratives about inbreeding and intelligence, revealing the complex interplay between genetics and environmental factors. We must avoid the mistake of viewing these individuals through a single lens, Dr. Lell cautioned. Their genetic challenges exist alongside unique capabilities and adaptation strategies. Their survival in such isolation speaks to remarkable resilience and problem-solving abilities. The doctor's research gradually shifted from clinical observation to collaborative exchange as he gained the family's trust. he began documenting their extensive knowledge of local ecology, traditional medicine, and historical weather patterns, information preserved through oral tradition that had scientific value beyond genetic research. I want to pause this narrative for a moment to ask you, the viewer, have you ever wondered how isolated communities develop their own unique adaptations and knowledge systems despite facing extraordinary challenges? Leave a comment saying isolation creates innovation if you've been fascinated by how humans find ways to survive and even thrive in the most difficult circumstances. Your comment helps us understand what aspects of these historical investigations resonate most deeply. The most significant scientific contribution from the Caldwell study came through blood samples voluntarily provided in early 1977. These samples, analyzed using the most advanced techniques available at the time, revealed distinctive markers that would later inform our understanding of genetic drift in isolated populations. Dr. Harriet Chun, who joined the research team in 1978, conducted a comparative analysis with other documented cases of consanguinity worldwide. The Caldwell case stands apart, she noted, because of its remarkable continuity. Most similar families eventually integrate with surrounding populations, diluting the genetic concentration. The Caldwell's exceptional isolation maintained these patterns longer than virtually any other documented case in modern medical literature. The research raised profound ethical questions about intervention versus autonomy. While the medical team could identify numerous conditions that modern treatment might address, they faced a family deeply skeptical of outside interference. Their approach ultimately balanced providing information and offering treatment while respecting the family's right to make their own healthcare decisions. This respect marked a significant departure from how such communities had historically been treated by medical authorities. Earlier cases of genetic isolation in American history had sometimes led to forced sterilization under eugenics programs of the early 20th century. Dr. Lell's team explicitly rejected such approaches, emphasizing education and consent rather than coercion. Thomas Caldwell, the family patriarch when the study began, initially resisted involvement but gradually became a crucial partner in the research. His personal journal, shared with Dr. Lell in 1979, revealed a man with a complex awareness of his family's situation. "We ain't ignorant of our troubles," he wrote. "We see what happens with each child born. But where were these doctors and their concern when my father couldn't get work because of how he looked? Where was help when we needed it before?" This perspective highlighted how the family's isolation had been reinforced by social rejection and economic marginalization, not merely geographic factors. Their genetic situation couldn't be separated from the broader social context of Appalachian poverty, industrial exploitation, and cultural stigmatization. By 1980, the research had expanded to include nutritional, environmental, and sociological dimensions. The family's diet, heavily dependent on locally grown and foraged food, showed significant nutritional gaps that compounded their genetic challenges. Their water source, tested for the first time, revealed mineral imbalances and contamination from nearby mining operations that had begun, affecting their health in ways unrelated to their genetics. The Caldwell family didn't exist in isolation from American history, though their remote hollow often insulated them from its direct impacts. Their story intersects with broader patterns of Appalachian life, revealing how social and economic forces helped create the conditions for their genetic isolation. From the 1880s to the 1920s, massive industrial exploitation of Appalachia's natural resources, particularly timber and coal, transformed the region. While surrounding communities were changed by this industrialization, the Caldwell's remote location initially protected them from direct displacement. However, as logging companies clear-cut forests on neighboring ridges, their watershed was irreversibly altered, affecting their agricultural sustainability and further encouraging their self-reliance. County employment records show that several Caldwell men sought work in coal mines during the 1930s Depression era. These records also document their quick departures, with manager notes citing their unsuitability for public-facing positions, a thinly veiled reference to their distinctive appearance. This rejection from the wage economy reinforced the family's retreat into subsistence living and traditional practices. The economic discrimination faced by the Caldwells represented a common pattern for those who didn't fit the emerging industrial order, explained Appalachian historian Dr. Eleanor Pritchard. When federal poverty programs expanded into Appalachia during the 1960s War on Poverty, the Caldwell family was initially overlooked entirely. A 1966 survey of regional needs failed to even document their existence, effectively rendering them invisible to assistance efforts. It wasn't until a public health initiative in 1972 that their situation came to official attention, ultimately leading to Dr. Lell's involvement. This pattern of oversight wasn't accidental, but reflected systematic neglect of the most isolated Appalachian communities. Similar families existed throughout the region, though few maintained such complete genetic isolation for as many generations. The Caldwells represented an extreme case of broader regional patterns of marginalization. Public perception of the family shifted dramatically following initial newspaper coverage in 1978. What began as sensationalized accounts of mountain inbreeding gradually evolved into more nuanced reporting on rural healthcare access and regional inequality. The Caldwell case became a catalyst for examining how modern America could still contain pockets of such profound isolation. Local attitudes exhibited the most significant transformation. While previous generations had treated the family with fear and ridicule, creating the social rejection that reinforced their isolation, community response to their story began shifting toward recognition of collective responsibility. "We failed them before we ever knew them," acknowledged County Commissioner Harold Williams in a 1979 public hearing on rural health services. "These aren't just their problems, they're our problems as a society that allowed such isolation to persist into the modern era." This recognition came too late to reverse generations of genetic concentration, but it marked a crucial shift in how such communities were perceived, not as curiosities or cautionary tales, but as fellow citizens deserving of dignity and inclusion in social systems. The Caldwell case also challenged scientific assumptions about rural isolation. Far from representing simple ignorance or backwardness, their situation demonstrated complex adaptation strategies and resilience in the face of exclusion. Their traditional ecological knowledge, preservation of archaic English linguistic patterns, and maintenance of pre-industrial craft techniques represented valuable cultural heritage rather than merely the absence of modernity. As the 1970s progressed, various family members began engaging with wider society in limited but significant ways. Younger Caldwells, particularly Thomas's grandchildren, showed interest in education and broader social connection, though always returning to the family hollow rather than fully integrating into mainstream communities. This gradual opening coincided with changing Appalachian identity movements that began celebrating rather than stigmatizing regional distinctiveness. The family found themselves in a changing social landscape where their deep connection to place and traditional knowledge gained new respect, even as their genetic challenges remained. By the early 1980s, the Caldwell family story had transformed from medical curiosity to a complex case study at the intersection of genetics, sociology, history, and ethics. Their legacy continues to inform our understanding of isolated communities and the delicate balance between cultural autonomy and social responsibility. The medical outcomes for individual family members varied significantly. Jacob Caldwell, whose physical challenges were most severe, received corrective surgeries in 1978 that improved his mobility but couldn't fully address conditions that had developed over decades without treatment. He lived until 1992, spending his final years as a skilled woodcarver whose distinctive creations became valued for both their craftsmanship and the story they represented. Sarah, whose remarkable memory had impressed researchers, eventually worked with linguists documenting Appalachian speech patterns and traditional knowledge systems. Her contributions to preserving regional plant lore and weather prediction methods were published in 1985, marking a transformation from research subject to knowledge contributor in her own right. Elijah, after receiving treatment for several medical conditions, developed a relationship with a mechanical engineer who recognized his intuitive understanding of machinery. Their collaboration led to several practical innovations for small-scale farming equipment adapted to steep terrain, addressing challenges common throughout Appalachia. The younger generation of Caldwells demonstrated how quickly genetic patterns can shift when isolation ends. Several cousins married partners from neighboring communities in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and their children showed significantly reduced expression of the physical characteristics that had defined previous generations. The rapid normalization of genetic traits within just one generation of outmarriage demonstrates the resilience of human genetics, noted Dr. Chun in her final follow-up study in 1986. While 5 generations of isolation created distinctive patterns, a single generation of genetic diversity began reversing these effects immediately. This biological resilience paralleled social adaptation. By the mid-1980s, the Caldwell Hollow was no longer entirely isolated. Improved roads, telephone access, and regular medical visits connected the family to wider communities while allowing them to maintain their distinct identity and deep connection to their ancestral land. The original homestead, continuously occupied since the 1840s, was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1994, recognizing its significance to Appalachian cultural heritage. The designation acknowledged not just the unique genetic history, but the family's remarkable preservation of traditional knowledge, construction techniques, and sustainable adaptation to challenging mountain environments. Dr. Lell's research methodology became a model for ethical engagement with isolated communities. His approach, prioritizing relationship building, respecting autonomy, and recognizing the value of traditional knowledge, influenced a generation of medical researchers working in rural Appalachia and similar regions worldwide. Educational programs developed from the case now serve as training materials for rural healthcare providers, emphasizing how medical conditions cannot be separated from their social, historical, and economic contexts. What began as a study of genetic isolation evolved into a comprehensive framework for understanding health disparities in marginalized communities. The legal and ethical questions raised by the Caldwell case contributed to evolving standards for research consent and community engagement. Their experience demonstrated the importance of approaching vulnerable populations as partners rather than subjects, recognizing their agency even amid challenging circumstances. Thomas Caldwell, the family patriarch who initially resisted outside involvement, reflected on this legacy shortly before his death in 1988. "We were always more than our troubles. We kept this land when others left. We remembered the old ways when others forgot. Maybe our story helps others see that staying put has both its costs and its wisdom." This perspective challenges simplified narratives about progress and isolation. The Caldwell family's experience reveals both the biological consequences of extreme genetic isolation and the cultural resilience that allowed them to maintain a continuous presence on their land despite enormous challenges. Their story exists in conversation with broader patterns in American history: how industrialization transformed rural communities, how modernization created new forms of exclusion alongside new opportunities, and how distinct cultural knowledge systems persisted despite pressure toward homogenization. Today, the former Caldwell property hosts an educational center focused on Appalachian cultural heritage and sustainable mountain agriculture. Descendants of the family serve as educators, transforming a legacy of isolation into a resource for regional revitalization, blending traditional knowledge with modern science in a working partnership. The scientific understanding gained from studying the family's genetic patterns continues to inform medical research into recessive genetic conditions and the dynamics of small population genetics. What was once viewed through a lens of abnormality is now recognized as an important window into understanding human genetic diversity and adaptation. If you've watched this far, it's because you value these profound human stories that reveal so much about our shared history and biology. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the in-depth historical investigations on this channel." Please subscribe if you haven't already. These meticulously researched historical cases require hundreds of hours to investigate and present with accuracy. By liking, sharing, and subscribing, you ensure this important educational work can continue, bringing light to forgotten chapters of our collective past. The Caldwell family's journey from extreme isolation to becoming contributors to our understanding of human resilience represents not just a medical case study, but a testament to how even the most marginalized stories ultimately become essential parts of our shared human narrative. Their legacy reminds us that in the study of human difference, we discover not just scientific principles, but profound truths about dignity, adaptation, and the enduring strength of communities facing extraordinary challenges.